Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi shir.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, Shabbos Daf Tesvav. We're on the second line from the top. Says the Gemara. Gufa, we learned, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Yud Ches Gazru. There were 18 gzeros that were enacted by the Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel. Uve Yud Ches Nechalku. And regarding those 18 halachas, they had a machlokes, they had a difference of opinion. And they debated these halachas. And finally, the opinion of Beis Shammai prevailed, and they concluded by enacting those 18 gzeros. Says the Gemara, was that the case? Was there really a difference of opinion regarding these 18 things? V'atanya, but haven't we learned? Hushvu, that there was absolutely no difference of opinion regarding these things. Says the Gemara, it depends at what point. Initially, on the first day, indeed, there was a machlokes, there was a debate regarding these things. And the Shita of Beis Shammai prevailed, and they concluded on making the gzeros. Ulamachar, however, tomorrow, on the next day, Hushvu, indeed, they had a meeting of the minds, and Beis Hillel acquiesced and submitted to the opinion of Beis Shammai, and going forward, there was no more difference of opinion. Continues the Gemara Gufa, we learned, Amar Rav Huna, the Gimel Mekaimis, we only find 3 instances, Nechalku Shammai v'Hillel, that there was a dispute of machlokes between the Rabbeim, between the teachers, Shammai and Hillel themselves. Where were those 3 places? So the first one is regarding the obligation of challah, the chiyuv to separate a portion of the dough and give it to the kohen. Now, what is the volume, what is the amount of dough which obligates one to perform this mitzvah of challah? How much flour does it have to contain? So Rashi explains that the Torah says, Reishis arisei seichem tarimu. We're meant to remove a portion of your dough. Who is the Torah speaking to? Arisei seichem, your dough. The Torah is speaking to the Yidden, to the Yisrael who were in the Midbar. So in the desert, what was the size of their dough? The size was the portion that they received from the man. And how large a portion was that? The Torah tells us that the portion was asiris ha'efa, a tenth of an ephah. How big is an ephah? An ephah is 18 kav. So what follows is that their portion was a tenth of 18 kav. And indeed, this size of a dough is chayav b'challah, a dough that contains this amount of flour. So we're going to have a Mishnah with various opinions as to how this concept, this principle, is applied. Exactly how large size of a dough is required. Continues the Gemara. It's actually a Mishnah in Edius. Shama omer mikav challah. A dough which contains a kav is chayav and challah. V'hillel omer mikabayim. It requires 2 kav. Now, how do they get to these amounts? So they're trying to give us a lengthy mathematical presentation here. Perhaps for clarity purposes, we'll just present it very briefly. So once again, the shear of an isa of challah is derived from the shear of isas midbar, of the dough, of the size of the dough that the Yidden had in the midbar, their portion of the man. How large was the isas midbar? So we said it was a tenth of an ephah. How much is an ephah? 18 kav. So what follows is that the shear of isas midbar was 2 kav. So if you'll ask, a tenth of 18 isn't 2, it's merely 1.8. So Taisus explains that when we speak about a tenth, we're actually applying a formula called asiris milavar, an external tenth. The more simple way of saying a tenth is that a tenth of 18 is 1.8. That's an internal tenth, asiris milagav. Here we measure with a formula called asiris milavar, an external tenth. It works as follows. We do a tenth of the total number, meaning after we add this tenth to the original number, a tenth of that total number is the asiris milavar. For instance, what is an external tenth of 9? The answer is 1, because we'll take 1 and add it to 9. We'll have a total of 10, and indeed 1 is a tenth of this total amount, which consists of the initial amount plus this tenth. Here too, regarding 18 Eifa, which was 18 kav. So what is an external tenth? It's the number 2. Because if we'll add 2 to 18, we get to the number 20. And indeed, what is a tenth of this total amount of 20? That is 2. So this is the source of Hillel. Hillel says, an Isa which has 2 kav, that's equivalent to Isas Midbar, to the portion of the man, which was 2 kav. And therefore, that is the required amount for Chiyuv Chala. Shammai agrees in principle to this concept. However, he says, let's remember that the Isas Midbar was actually split into 2 portions because they had 2 meals. It was split into a meal b'boiker and a meal b'erev. So if we take those 2 kav and we split into 2, we arrive at an amount of 1 kav, and that is considered to be the shear of Isas Midbar. We look at each Suda separately. So again, Shammai Omer Mikav Chala, 1 kav, V'Hillel Omer Mikabayim, 2 kav. V'Chachamim Omer Lo K'divrei Zeh, we don't follow Shammai's words, or V'Lo K'divrei Zeh, nor Hillel's words. Ella, the Chachamim hold somewhere in the middle. Elo kav umechza chayiv b'chala. 1.5 kav is the shear of chayiv chala. How did they arrive at that amount? So the Farshim explain, according to the Chachamim, they took the 18 kav. Once again, we said the Isas Midbar was equivalent to the portion of the man, which was Asiris Eifa. The Eifa was 18 kav, so a tenth of that is Isas Midbar. The Chachamim measured with the simple formula of Asiris Mulagav, a straightforward tenth. What is a tenth of 18? 1.8. So how they arrive at 1.5? So the answer is that the measurements in Yerushalayim were actually larger than those that were used previously in the Midbar. So in a measurement of 1.5 kav in Yerushalayim, it would enter the amount of 1.8 of the Midbar. So it's actually the same exact amount. Once again, Elokavo Mechzachay B'chala, 1.5 kav of this enlarged Yerushalayim measurement, that is sufficient to be Mechayev B'chala, because in this 1.5 kav is contained the previous 1.8 of the Midbar, which was smaller kavim. Continues the Mishnah, when those measurements were enlarged even further at a certain point in history, so they need to modify the amount slightly again. Amru, and they said, not only don't you need 1.8, you don't even need 1.5, because in the present day measurements, much more will fill up this amount than previously. And therefore, in a measurement of 1.25 kav, you already have the old 1.5. Therefore they said, Amru chameshes revoim kemach, 5/4 of a kav, meaning 1.25 of a kav, chayavin b'chala is already the sufficient amount and is chayav b'chala. So once again, according to the Chachamim, we take the 18 kav, which was the Eifa, and we say the Isas Midbar was a tenth of that, which is 1.8 kavin. When we use the Midbar size kavin, which was smaller, when they went to Yerushalayim and they enlarged the kavin, at that point they said, well, instead of 1.8, we only need 1.5, which is equivalent to the old 1.8. Then when they enlarged their measurements even more, they went down to 1.25. Rabbi Yossi Eimer, Heib Turin. Rabbi Yossi seems to agree with the Chachamim's approach, but he adds just a little bit. He says 5/4, meaning 1.25 of kav, is still pater. Heib Oid, if you add a bit more, then it's chayiv. Why is that? Explains Rashi. Because according to Rabbi Yossi, the eggs in the Midbar were a bit larger than our size eggs, and we know that all these volumes, all these measurements of kav, etc., are based. They use the base measurement of a volume of an egg, of a kibetza. So they're based on the volumes of eggs, and therefore Rabbi Yossi maintains that we're a bit off, because in the Midbar their eggs were a bit larger than ours. They were 5% larger, and therefore, in order to compensate for that, because to compensate and make up for the fact that our eggs are smaller than those in the Midbar, we need to add an additional 5%. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, we need to add to the share of the Chachamim just a little bit, just an amount of 5%. Now Rashi points out that the shear of challah, according to the shita, is 43 and a bit eggs, a shear of about mem gimel beitzim. And it's interesting that the Medrash says that there's a remes to this as well, because the numeric value of the word challah is actually 43. So this corresponds to the 43 egg volumes which make up the shear of the dough, which is chayav in challah. So, in summary, we have a Mishnah with 4 shitas regarding chayav challah. What is the required amount to be chayav in challah? Shammai says a kav, Hillel says 2 kav. The Chacham say nowadays it's 1 1/4 kav. Rabbi Yossi says add 5%. Continues the Gemara v'idach. So what's the next machlekes we find between Shammai and Hillel? This is pertaining to the halacha of mikveh. We know a mikveh is meant to be filled with water that was not contained in a kli. However, if one should pour mayim she'uvim, water which was drawn into a kli, and he pours it into a mikveh which was not yet filled to its required capacity of 40 sah, he can invalidate the mikveh. He can disqualify the mikveh. Now, how much mayim she'uvim is paisal sa mikveh? We need a significant amount of mayim. How much is that? We have machlekes. Says the Gemara, v'idach Hillel omer meloi hin, an amount of a hin which is 12 lug. That much mayim she'uvim paislam es mikveh. That's a significant amount. That's the largest liquid amount we find in the Torah, and that indeed can disqualify a mikveh. Now, why did Hillel choose to use the term hin, which is something we don't find generally in the Mishnayos? It's a biblical term. Why didn't he use the term 12 log instead? The answer is shechayv adam loymar b'lashon rabbi. One is meant to use the same term, the same language as his teacher. Since his Rebbe used this term, he also opted to use it. This is Rashi's pshat. The Rambam says that the teachers of Hillel were Shmai and Naphtali, who were converts, who were gerim, and had difficulty expressing the letter hey. Therefore, instead of saying hin, they instead would say in. And Hillel followed that. He would pronounce it in the same way. He would say maloi in mayim she'uvim paisas hamikvah. The question is why? And the answer is because one is meant to use the same language as his teacher. Says the Vilna Gaon, we don't find that in the Mishnah. We find that Hillel actually says maloi hin mayim she'uvim. Says the Vilna Gaon, it means as follows: that indeed Hillel himself would certainly say hin. However, his Rebbeim Shmai and Naphtali, since they had difficulty saying hin, and they needed to say in, so in their case, there was room for error. That a person can draw the conclusion from their words that in mayim she'uvim paisas hamikvah, that mayim she'uvim does not disqualify a mikvah. He would interpret in as meaning ein, it doesn't. And therefore, Shmai and Naphtali will compel to add another word to their teaching, to their statement. Instead of merely saying in the mayim she'uvim paisas hamikvah, they need to add another word, maloi, in the mayim she'uvim paisas hamikvah. In this case, it made it obvious what the halacha was trying to say. It made their intentions pretty clear. And therefore, once they packaged it in this way, maloi in mayim she'uvim paisas hamikvah, there was no more room for error and confusion. So this is what the Mishnah means to say. Why did Hillel need to add the word maloi? Since Hillel could pronounce it properly, he was able to say hin mayim she'uvim, so there's no room for error or confusion. Why did he need to add the word maloi? The answer is shechayv adam loymar b'lashon rabbi. He followed the same expression as his Rebbeim, and just as they added the word maloi, he also added the word maloi, even though in his case it wasn't really so necessary. So we have 3 pshatim in this Mishnah. We have Rashi's pshat. The question is, why did he use the word hin to begin with, which is a biblical term? We have the Rambam's pshat. Why did he express it as in? And we have the Vilna Gaon's pshat. Why did he add the word maloi? And their answer is because one is meant to follow the exact terminology and expression of his teacher. So that's a shita of Hillel, that the amount of a hin of mayim she'uvim is paisas hamikvah. Shammai omer tisha kaven. We require much more than that. 9 kaven, the Mefarshim explain, that's a significant amount which is suitable for a bath. So therefore it's called a shir chashav. It's also the amount of tisha kaven used by a balkari. So this is the shir chashav which can be paisas hamikvah. The third opinion, we don't follow Shammai or Hillel, but rather a third Shita. Until two weavers, two Gardim, two weavers, came from the Shara Ashra, from the Dung Gate in Yerushalayim. Ve'idu, and they testified. Mishum Shmaya v'Avtal, in the name of Shmaya v'Avtal. What is the exact amount of Mayim Shuvim that disqualifies a mikveh? Shloish lugim Mayim Shuvim b'is mikveh. The amount of 3 lug is significant enough to disqualify a mikveh. Farshim explained 3 lug is a typical amount that one needs for a shower, so it is a shir chashav, and it can disqualify a mikveh. Says the Mishnah, V'kimu chacham mesavreim. And indeed, the chachamim endorsed their words and their opinion, and established the halacha that the amount of 3 lug is paislas hamikveh. Now Rashi points out, why does the Mishnah need to elaborate on their profession, on their location? The Mishnah is generally very brief in its presentation. Says Rashi, the Mishnah is coming to send a message, to teach us a lesson. We know that these people were very ordinary people. Their profession was undignified, to the extent that the Gemara says that those that are involved in this profession of weaving, they cannot present a candidate for the position of a melech or kohen gadol. So they were involved in an undignified profession, and they were situated in a very undesirable location, Shara Ashpois. Nevertheless, they carried the day. Their words of Torah, their testimony was the final word. The Chacham endorsed their words, their Torah. So this teaches us a powerful lesson. One should never underestimate his ability. One should never negate himself and his abilities and his standing, and not to prevent yourself. Lo yimna adam in Beis HaMedrash, atzum Beis HaMedrash. A person should not stay away from Torah of Beis HaMedrash. Torah belongs to all. Everybody has a connection and a part of Torah. Even these 2 individuals were able to carry the day, and the halacha was determined according to them. Continues Gemara v'idach. So what was the third example of a machlokes between Shammai and Hillel? Shammai omer kol anashim, all women who see dam, dayan she'atan. It is sufficient that they are tummy only from now going forward, not retroactively. V'Hillel omer mipkida lepkida. They are tummy retroactively, way back till the last bedika, till the last examination. We're concerned that perhaps the dam began flowing from that point and on. Therefore, we consider it to be tummy to a certain extent if she touched truma or kachim. We consider it to be tummy retroactively, and she is tummy from the point in time that she made her last bedika up until now. Afilu yamim harbe, even though her last bedika was many days ago. No, like the we don't follow Shammai's view or Hillel's view. Ella, we have a third approach to this. Ella me'es la'es, me'mayit alidei mipkida l'pkida. There are 2 zmanim, there are 2 time frames here. There's a time frame of mipkida to her last examination. There's another zman of me'es la'es, 24-hour period going back. So whichever one is more recent, we are lenient. Whichever one is more recent, that is the zman that we follow. If the me'es la'es is more recent than her last examination, for instance, her last bedika was 2 days ago, then we are only metami her retroactively for 24 hours. Me'es la'es, the zman of 24 hours, is mimayit. It diminishes, it minimizes from the shir al yidei mipkida l'pkida, from the shir of mipkida l'pkida, from the examination to the next examination. Meaning, if the examination was prior to 24 hours, she's only tummy retroactively up until 24 hours. The same thing in the reverse. If the examination of the bdika was more recent than 24 hours ago, then we follow that zman. Umipkida l'pkida mimayit. That diminishes al yad me'es la'es. So either way we go l'kula, whichever one is more recent, whether it's me'es la'es or her last bdika. So here is the third and final machlokes between Shammai and Hillel regarding the tumah of an isha nida. Says more, is that the case? We don't find any more disputes between Shammai and Hillel. V'usul leka. V'ika, we have another one. Hillel omer lismach. This is regarding doing smicha on a carbon on yantiv. You do make smicha on yantiv. V'Shammai mishloi lismach. Says more, kika hamar Rav Huna. Rav Huna only factored into his list heicha delekla plukta darvasa badayu. When there is no machlokes amongst the scholars of the earlier generations together with the machlekes of Hillel and Shammai. But in this case of smicha, this was an old machlekes. This was a dispute which began years before Hillel and Shammai. And therefore, it's not something exclusive to Hillel and Shammai, and therefore Rav Huna did not put it onto his list. Says Gemara, we have another one. If one harvests his grapes to take it to the wine press, and some juice oozed out of the grapes, and moisturized the grapes. So we know then when fruit becomes moist, it becomes huksha lekabel tumah, becomes prepared and able to attract. It's susceptible to contracting tumah, but that's provided that the owner is pleased regarding the presence of this liquid. So in this case, that it's in a basket and the liquid is merely dripping out and getting lost. He has no use for it. Nevertheless, says Shammai, it becomes huksha. Shammai huksha, that the liquid has a significance and it does apply hechsher to the grapes on account of them getting wet by this liquid, even though it's going liibut and he doesn't really care for it, doesn't really have any use for this liquid. Why? Explains Rashi. It's a gzeira, a safeguard for the time where a person will harvest the grapes in these waterproof baskets, where the liquid indeed will be contained therein, and in that case certainly wants the liquid, and it has the ability to be machshir. So therefore Shammai applied this din to any type of basket as a safeguard for that scenario. No, it doesn't do hechsher because it's going liibud and the person doesn't really want it. So we have another machlekes between Shammai and Hillel. So why did Rav Huna not add this to his list? It says we don't count this one. The hasam kashasik leHillel Shammai. Eventually, Hillel acquiesced to Shammai. He was silent. He was silent in the face of Shammai's arguments. He agreed. He submitted to the argument of Shammai, and at the end of the day, there was no machlekes. Therefore, it doesn't belong on our list. So in summary, we have three disputes between Hillel and Shammai regarding challah, regarding mayim she'uvim, regarding the isha nida. Regarding challah, we have four shitas. Hillel says the shear of a dough is 2 kav. That is equivalent to the isas midbar. According to Shammai, we merely require 1 kav. Half of the isas midbar, since the isas midbar, the portion of the man, was split into 2 for 2 meals. According to the Chum, it's 1 1/4 kav. According to Rav Yossi, it's a bit more than 1 1/4 kav on account of the fact that the eggs today are smaller than those in the midbar. Regarding mayim she'uvim, which disqualify a mikveh, we have 3 shitas. According to Hillel, it is the shear hin, which is 12 lug. According to Shammai, it's 9 kav. According to the Chachamim, it's actually shleisha lug in mayim she'uvim. Finally, regarding an isha nida, a woman who sees dam, according to Shammai, dayan she'atan, she's only tummy from here on in, going forward. According to Hillel, we go back to our last bedika, mipkida l'pkida. According to the Chachamim, we have 2 zmanim. We have mipkida l'pkida, we also have me'is la'is, whichever one is more recent. If the last examination is more recent than 24 hours, then we follow that. If the examination was prior to 24 hours, then she's only metame going back to 24 hours, so if she touched truma or kachim, from then till now, she was metame then. Continues the Gemara, Yosef ben Yeesha is trader, v'Yosef ben Yechana is Yerushalayim. So these 2 Yosefs, Gazru Tuma al Eretz Amim. They enacted a gzeira of Tuma for Eretz Amim, for Chutz La'aretz. As we learned yesterday, the Goyim wouldn't really mark their graves properly, therefore there's a concern that a person might encounter a caver and become Tameh. So they made a gzeira on the entire Chutz La'aretz. V'al Chizchuches, they applied a Tuma to glassware. We don't find the halachas of Tumah v'Tara applied to glass in the Torah. And therefore, they made a gzeira to apply the halachas of Tumah to glass as well. Says the Gemara, is this the case? These 2 Yosefs were the one who were geyser on these things. V'harabbanan, the Shmoinim Shana geyser was actually the Rabbanan within the 80 years. Soon the Gemara will explain what this means. They were the one who made these gzeiras. The Rav Kahana, Shechala B'Shmuel Bar Yosi. When Rishon Yossi fell ill, Shochlei, they sent him a message. Rebbe, Emer Lanu, please tell us, give us over, relate to us, Beis v'gvim l'dvarim, 2 or 3 things, She'amarta mishum avicha, that you say over in the name of your father, Rabbi Yossi. Shalach lehem, so he responded as follows. Kach amar Abba, this is what my father says. Kuf Peishana Asher Lecharv Habayis. My father said as follows: 180 years prior to the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, Pashta Malchus Arisha al Yisrael, the Malchus Arisha, the wicked kingdom, this is referring to Rome, spread its kingdom and were spread its power over Klal Yisrael. So their Malchus spread over on Klal Yisrael. Peishan Ashlachar Habayis, 80 years prior to Churban Habayis, Gazra Tuma al Eretz Amim. So the Rabbanon will Gazra Tuma al Eretz Amim on Chutz La'aretz va'al Chutz, and they applied the halachas of Tuma to glassware as well. The third stage was Mem Shana Ashlachar Habayis, 40 years prior to Churban. The following thing happened: Golsel Sanhedrin, the Beis Din HaGadol, the supreme court of Klal Yisrael, which used to be in the Lishkas HaGazos in the Beis Hamikdash, they went into exile. V'yoshel b'chanuyos, and they sat in a place called Chanus in Har Habayis. What was the halachic ramification of this change of location? Says the Gemara, actually very significant. On Rabbi Yisrael bar Dimi, loymar shelo yidonu dinei knasis. They couldn't anymore judge cases of penalty of knas. Says the Gemara, why? Dinei knasis al kadaitach. Can you say that to be true? Dinei knasis is not dependent if they're sitting in the Lishkas HaGazos or not. They can continue judging knasis even in the chanus. Ella rather, ema shelo yidonu dinei nefashos. Once they changed their location, they moved out of the Lishkas HaGazos. They had no ability anymore to judge dinei nefashos, cases of capital punishment. Why? Because even though dinei nefashos is not dependent primarily, exclusively on the Beis Din HaGadol, even lower courts can judge dinei nefashos. Nevertheless, there's a stipulation, there's a condition. They only have the power to do dinei nefashos when the Beis Din HaGadol, when the highest court is functioning in their proper location in the Lishkas HaGazos. Otherwise, all courts lose their authority to judge, to conduct dinei nefashos. The Farshim explained that there were many murderers at that time, kinefishi roitzchin, and therefore the Chachamim saw, the Dayanim saw that it wasn't anymore a time appropriate to start getting involved in these numerous murders, and therefore they decided to leave the Beis Din HaGadol. This way, they don't even have the authority to get involved in capital punishment cases. Okay, so we see from this Gemara that who were the ones who enacted, who made the gzera of Eretz Amim, of Kleis Chuchis. It was actually the Chachamim who were present during this era, during this point in time in history, which was the 80 last years prior to the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. Says, okay, so what's the problem? Perhaps Yosef ben Yezer and Yosef ben Yochanan were also around at that time. That's not true. It's not historically correct. Perhaps you will say that they too, Yosef ben Yezer, Yosef ben Yochanan, they lived during this era, during these 80 years. Says Noah, but it's not chronologically correct. Vatanya, haven't we learned? Hillel v'Shimon, Gamliel v'Shimon, Nogu nisiusan b'fnei habayis miyashana. That Hillel and his son Shimon, and his son Gamliel, and his son Shimon, they were the ones that held the office of Nesius. They were the Nesim of Klal Yisrael. So their positions spanned this last 100 years prior to Churban Habayis. They were the Nesim, the last Nesim prior to Churban Habayis. V'ilu, Yosef ben Yezer, Ish Trader, v'Yosef ben Yochanan v'Kad Mituva. And we know from history, recorded in Pirkei Avos, that these two Yosefs were actually way earlier in history than Hillel. There were many generations prior to Hillel. So it must be that they lived at a point in time way earlier than the end of the Beis Hamikdash. So it can't be that they were the ones who enacted the Gzera 80 years prior to the destruction of the temple, because they lived many years earlier than that. So we have a contradiction. Who were the ones who made the Gzera on Eretz Amim and Kleis Chuchis? Was it the Chachamim, the Rabbanon of Peishana, who lived during the last 80 years of the Beis Hamikdash? Or were it Yosef ben Yezer and Yosef ben Yechon, who lived way earlier? Says Gemara, Ella, you must say as follows. Indeed, they both did it. They all did it. The Gezerah took place, took hold, was implemented in two phases. Says Gemara as follows. Ella also inu the two Yosefs Gazer Agusha Lisreif. They made a very limited Gezerah. They said that on the gush, on a clod, a clump of earth of Eretz Amim, if that touches Truma, the Truma needs to be burnt. Gazer Agusha Lisreif. However, Va'avira of Leiklum, on the airspace of Eretz Amim, they didn't apply any Truma to that. So it was a limited Gezerah. That was the first phase, the first stage of the Gezerah. And then Ba'asr Rabbanan the Peishana, then the scholars of the 80 years, the last 80 years of the Bnei Bayis, they came along and they added more stringency to this Gezerah. Gazer Avir Litlois. They said that the airspace as well has the power to send the Truma into uncertainty, into a Tliya state, a state of limbo. We're not allowed to eat it, we don't burn it, but it's a state of limbo, it's an uncertain Truma. So they added another element to the Gezerah. So this will reconcile the stira. It's not a contradiction. Indeed, there were two phases to the Gezerah. It began with the two Yosefs and concluded with the Chacham of the Peishana. Says no, but that can't be so. Lememra, are you going to say that Tchilo Chad Gezerah Hava L'Sreifa, that the Gezerah began initially with a component of Sreifa? We said that the first phase contained an element of Sreifa, that if the Truma touches the gush, it requires to be burnt. But that's not so. V'amar Ilfa, Yodayim, only the Gezerah regarding Stam Yodayim, unrinsed hands that have a din of Tumah, only regarding that Gezerah was the Gezerah established initially with an element of Gezerah. Yodayim Chiloson Gezerah L'Sreifa. Was it established with an element of a Gezerah L'Sreifa, that if it comes in contact with Truma, it requires to be burnt, it has a din of a definite Tumah. Yodayim, who did Chilas Gezerah L'Sreifa, only regarding Yodayim was that element of Sreifa contained initially. We infer from there that any other Gezerah did not have this stringency at the outset. So you can't say that the first phase of the Gezerah of Eretz Am already contained this element of Sreifa. He says, well, okay, we'll propose a different approach. Ella will say as follows. So we'll go back to the same approach. There were two phases in the Gezerah, but we'll modify it somewhat. Also, Inu. So the first phase was from the two Yosefs. They came along and they made a Gezerah Gazer Agusha Litlois. They said that the clod of the Chutz La'aretz has the power to throw the Truma into uncertainty. Va'avir v'leklum, and the airspace has no significance. Doesn't even give any uncertainty of Tumah. It has no din of Tumah whatsoever. So that was the first phase, very lenient. V'asr Rabbanan Peishana. Then the Rabbanan Peishana came along. They added another stringency and they said, Gazer Agusha L'Sreif, that the clump of earth of Eretz Am has the power to apply a definite Tumah to the Truma, and we're required to burn the Truma. Va'avir Litlois, and the airspace as well has somewhat of a Tumah. It's an uncertain Tumah, and it can throw the Truma into a state of uncertainty. If it comes into contact, if the Truma is present in the airspace of Eretz Amim. So, we seem to have solved our problem. We reconciled the stira as follows. Indeed, there were two stages, two phases of the implementation of the Gezerah Eretz Amim. It began with one lenient phase, and another stringent phase was added to it later on. It says, well, is that the case? We find elsewhere that the Gezerah Eretz Amim was actually enacted in Usha, in the town of Usha, way later. Many years. Kameshanim, Rashi says, Acha Churban. So this was at a much later state, much later point in history. Tisnan, as we find in the following Mishnah. The Mishnah gives us a list of 6 type of things that if Truma comes into contact with these things, although these things are merely uncertain, they're sfekas, they're not definite tumas, nevertheless the Chacham applied a status of a definite tumah to them, and should they come into contact with Truma, we go ahead and we burn the Truma as a result. Tisnan al vav sfeka yisofnas truma. For the following 6 uncertain tumas. Number 1, al safek beis hapras. Beis hapras is a field which contained a grave, which was plowed over. The Chacham was suspected that, were concerned that some of the mace, some of the bones were scattered, and therefore they applied a tumah to the Beis HaPras. So the Beis HaPras has a tumah misafik, midrabanan. So if truma comes into contact with the Beis HaPras, this is one of the 6 fekas that will result in us burning the truma. If it comes into contact with afar, with earth that comes from Eretz Amim, this too is a gzera d'Rabbanan, and therefore, even though it's an uncertain tumah, it requires streifa. If it comes into contact with a garment of Amaretz, and in that case, there's a concern that it's tamei, perhaps on account of his wife who was a nida, or another reason. So in any case, the big Amaretz contain a safek tumah, an uncertain tumah, and here too we burn the truma as a result. What is the next halacha of asafek kelan and tzayin? We find a utensil lying around. We don't know if it's tamei tar, so it has a din of a safek tumah. Val safek harukin, if we find saliva, we don't know if it came from a zav, which is tamei or not. So this safek harukin is also one of those which cause the tumah to get burnt. Val safek meraglei adam, if we have meraglayim that is lying, and we don't even know if it belongs to an adam. We certainly don't know if the adam was tamei or tar, so it seems like we have a double suffix. Nevertheless, the Chacham applied a din of a definite tumah to it. And the Mishnah continues, al safek meiragli adam shekeneged meiragli behema. Even though it's right next to it, situated in close proximity to meiraglayim, urine of a behema, as Rashi points out, this gives us reason to suspect that perhaps the other meiraglayim as well originated from a behema. Nevertheless, even though we have so many mitigating factors, we have reason to believe that it's from a behema, which is certainly tar. Even if it's from an adam, we don't know if the adam was tamei or tar. Nevertheless, we give it a din of avad tumah with regards to if truma touches it, it needs to be burnt. As the Mishnah concludes, al vade magoin, if truma touches any of these items, if it certainly touched one of these items, we know for sure that it touched it, which is shehu safek tumasan. It touched any of these items which contain a safek tumah. On account of that, the result is soifenes truma. So according to the Tanakama, this halacha only applies if we know for sure that the truma came into contact with these items. But if we're uncertain of whether the truma actually touched these items, then this stringency won't apply. Rabbi Yossi Omer, he adds another chumrah, afal safek ma'gon. Even if we're uncertain, we have a doubt whether the tumah actually came into contact with these items, if it took place in a private domain, soifen, then we apply the halacha that a safek tumah in Rosh Hashanah is tamei, and we even burn the tumah as a result. The Chacham Ayrim, they took a middle route, a compromised, not as lenient as Tanakama, not as stringent as Rav Yossi, but rather b'rshus hayachid toilen. If we're uncertain whether we have a safek whether the truma touched any of these items, so if it took place in Rosh Hashanah, then the truma is pending, it's in limbo. We don't eat it, but we don't burn it. B'rshus harabim toir, if it took place in Rosh Hashanah, we apply the general concept of safek tumah b'rshus harabim is toir. So in summary, the Mishnah lists us 6 cases of safek tumah, which on account of these sfekas, we actually burn truma if truma were to come into contact with any of these 6 items. What are they? Number 1, Beis HaPras, a field where a grave was plowed into. Eretz Amim, Chutz La'aretz, Bigdei Amaretz, the clothing of Amaretz, Kelim Tzayim, Kelim which are found, and we're uncertain as to their state, whether they're tamei or tar. Roikin, saliva, which also has an uncertainty of whether it came from a person who was tar or not. And finally, Mei Regli Adam, we find Meraglayim, we have a suffix whether or not it's tamei. So if truma were to come into contact with any of these items, we actually burn the truma. The Chachamim applied a din of a definite tumah to all these scenarios. Now that's if the truma vadai touched it. If the truma certainly came into contact with these items. What about if there's a suffix maga? We're not sure whether at all the truma touched these things. What is Allah in that case? According to Tanakama, it's tar. According to Rav Yossi, Rosh Hashanah is considered to be valid tamei, and we burn the truma. According to the Chachamim, Rosh Hashanah we are toilen that sends the truma into a state of uncertainty. We don't eat it, but we don't burn it. In Rosh Hashanah, we consider it to be definitely tar. Continues the Gemara. Okay, va'amar ula, elu sfeikos v'usheskinu. These 6 sfeikos, this halacha regarding these 6 items, where was this enacted? Where was this stringency established? It was actually implemented in Usha. And this was at a much later date than the Binyan Habayis, at a much later point in history. So apparently, one of these zeros, which is Eretz Ha'amim, Tumas Eretz Ha'amim, was actually enacted much later. So this seems to be a contradiction. Here we say it was Yosei and Yosei who did it. Here we say it was the Chachamim during the last 80 years of Binyan Habayis. In this Mishnah we say clearly that it was the Chachamim in Usha at a much later date. Says the Gemara, okay, apparently the Gzeir of Eretz Ha'amim was implemented in 3 phases rather than 2. Ella, rather, asu inu gazer agusha litles. The first stage was Yosef ben Yezer and Yosef ben Yochanan proposed, they enacted a gzera, a very limited gzera. Asu inu, they came, gazer, they made a gzera agusha litles, that the clump of earth of Eretz Ha'amim has a din to throw the truma into uncertainty. We don't eat it, we don't burn it. If the truma touches the gush, we're merely toilet. Ve'avir v'loiklum, and the airspace of Eretz Ha'amim, that contains no tumah whatsoever. So it's a very limited form of exer. The next phase was v'asur abanan d'shmoinim shana gazer. They lifted it up a notch. Gazer idi litlis. They said not only does the gush have a din of tliya, also the airspace of Eretz Ha'amim has a din of an uncertain tumah, and if truma enters the airspace of Eretz Ha'amim, the truma is pending. We don't eat it, we don't burn it. So they enacted another stringency. They added another element to the gzera. The gzera of Avir Eretz Ha'amim. And finally, Ba'asa Ba'usha. In Usha they added another element. Gazra Agusha Lisraif. They applied the din Sreifa, as we see in this Mishnah, that Eretz Ha'amim is considered to be so stringent. And if Truma were to touch the gush, the clump of earth from Eretz Ha'amim, we burn it. We give it the status of a definite tumah. Ve'avir, however, regarding the airspace, that they didn't change, because the kai they left it as is. The airspace of Eretz Ha'amim is not so stringent. It's merely considered to be an uncertain tumah, and if truma enters there, we are toilet. It is pending. We don't eat it, but we don't burn it. So, in summary, what were the 3 phases of the Gzeres Eretz Ha'amim? It began with Yosei and Yosei, who geyser that the gush of Eretz Ha'amim requires tzliya. The Rabbanim Shemon Shana added the same status to the Avir. Finally, in Usha, they were geyser that the gush can bring truma to chiv sreifa. However, regarding airspace, they left it as is. Now, Taisus points out that what happened to the kasha regarding kleis chuchis? The Gemara asks the contradiction regarding both gzeres. Here we say Yosef ben Yezer and Yosef ben Yochanan will geyser gzer on Eretz Ha'amim and on kleis chuchis, on glassware, and then we find in the name of Rishmal, the name of his father of Yossi, who were the ones who made the gzera of Eretz Ha'amim and kleis chuchis? It was actually the Rabbanan of Shmoinim Shana, who lived during the last 80 years of the Binyan Habayis. So the Gemara merely reconciled the steer regarding Tumas Eretz Ha'amim. It took place in 3 stages, fine. What about the halacha of Tumas kleis chuchis? We never answered that kasha. So Taisus points out that there was actually another girsa. Some Sfarim have another girsa. The Gemara actually proposed another teretz earlier to answer this contradiction, that indeed the 2 Yosis proposed their gzeras, but it wasn't accepted. It didn't spread throughout Klal Yisrael, and therefore it didn't receive any legal validity. It wasn't accepted on the masses, and therefore it wasn't legally valid. However, later on, the Rabbanim Shemon Shana, when they proposed their gzera, at that point in time, it was accepted. Gazer v'kibul minayu. So this answer can address both questions. That regarding both series, Eretz Ha'amim and kleis chuchis, so initially it was proposed by 2 Yosis, but it wasn't accepted. And later on, it was proposed by the Rabbanim Shemon Shana. At that point, it was implemented and enacted. Continues the Gemara. Okay, what is the reason for kleis chuchis? Kleis chuchis, my time ago, Rabbanim. Why indeed did the Rabbanon apply the halachas of Tumah to glassware? We don't find in the Torah that there should be any dinim of Tumah applied to glassware. So why did the Rabbanon do so? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Omer Shlokish as follows. Hoyel, since utchilas briyasa min hachoil, since klei zchuchis are initially formed from sand, therefore shavinu rabbanu klichecheres. Therefore the Chacham equated them to earthenware kelim, because they're made from similar material. They're both made from some type of choil, some type of sand. And therefore they gave it the same status of klicheres, so that we don't confuse them, and therefore they're equated and put on in the same category. It says if that's the case, that the Chachamim applied the status of klei cheres even to glassware, if so, let's apply the following stringency to them as well. We know that a klei cheres can never achieve purity in a mikveh. If a klei cheres gets tummy, the only way to be retire it is to break it. As Rashi says, shrirasei mitarasei. One needs to break it or to perforate it in a manner that it's unfit for use, to nullify its utensil status, and thereby making it tar. So if that's the case, that kli zchuchis are equated with klei cheres, if so, one should not be able to be toivel to immerse a kli zchuchis in a mikveh when it becomes tummy. The only way out is to actually break it. Alam etnan, if so, why do we find in the Mishnah otherwise? The Mishnah speaks about toiveling klei zchuchis. The Mishnah says as follows: Ve'elu choytisim mikelim. The following things make a chatzitza, present a chatzitza, which is an interruption between the kli and the water. And when these things are present on a kli, one needs to remove them prior to immersion in the mikveh, otherwise the tefillah is invalid. What are these things that are present that make a chatzitza? Hazefes, pitch, v'hamur, some other type of sticky substance. If these are present on a kli zchuchis, so one needs to clean them prior to tefillah. So it's very clear from here that kli zchuchis belong in the mikveh. So apparently they don't have the same status of kli cheres. Says Zigmarach Mayaskinon. Indeed, generally speaking, klei zchuchis have the same halacha of klei cheres, and they cannot be immersed in a mikveh. However, in this case, in this Mishnah, we're speaking about a very unique case. Kigoyin, for instance, shenikvu, that the klei zchuchis, the glassware, got a hole. Vehetiv, and he dripped into this hole, he plugged it up. Vehetiv l'soichan aver, he plugged it with lead, which is a form of metal. So now, since the kli is being maintained, being made fit for use by this metal plug, so the halacha is that the entire kli assumes a new status, a new identity, has a status of metalware, of a metal kli, and therefore the halachas of metal will apply to it. So although the zchuchis got a hole, and as Rashi explains, when it gets a hole, it becomes tor because shvirasei mitarasei. Since it became unfit for use, the zchuchis is no more a kli. It's considered to be tor now. However, now that he plugged up this hole with this form of lead, this form of metal, now it assumes a new status. It's considered as though it's metalware. And indeed, one may immerse this kli in a mikveh and make it tar. It says, however, Rameyu, found the sheet of Rameyu, the Amah HaKol Heilech Achar Mamid. Everything follows the thing that supports it, that maintains it. The Sani, as we learned in the Brayse, klei zchuchis, glassware, shenikvu, that got a hole and became unfit for use. And then he dripped into this hole a plug of lead and rendered it fit for use going forward. So what halacha does this kli have? Is it considered to be glassware or metalware? It's machlekes. Rav Meir metame. Rav Meir considers it to be metalware on account of the metal plug that's maintaining it. Chacham say no, even now it still has a din of klei zchuchis, of glassware. So in summary, the Chacham made a gzera to be metame, to apply dinei tuma to all klei zchuchis, all glassware. Why? Since it is formed from sand, therefore it's similar to ordinary klei cheres, and therefore it has the dinei tuma just like earthenware. The Gemara says what follows this is that just as a klei cheres has no option of immersion in a mikveh when it's tummy, it needs to be broken in order to become tar. Klei zchuchis as well has the same restriction. The Gemara made one exception, that if a klei zchuchis is being maintained by a metal plug, according to Rav Meir, it now assumes the status of a klei matches, a metalware, a utensil made of metal, and therefore it can be immersed in a mikveh to purify it from its tumah. Perhaps let's take a quick review of the daf. We began with the Gemara telling us that on that day that they made the Yudches Gzeres, there was a great machlekes between the Shammai and Hillel, which concluded in those Yudches Gzeres. However, on the following day, Beis Hillel acquiesced and submitted to the opinion of Beis Shammai, and there was no difference of opinion going forward. The Gemara told us there are 3 instances where we find a machlekes between the teachers, the masters, Shammai and Hillel themselves. One is regarding challah. According to Hillel, the required amount of dough for challah is 2 kav, in accordance with the amount of isas midbar, the dough in the midbar, which was the portion of man that the Yidden received. According to Shammai, it's half that amount, because we're meant to split that in half for 2 sudas. The portion of man was meant to be applied to 2 meals, and therefore each isa constitutes only 1 kav. The Gemara told us regarding a machlekes of mayim she'uvim, water drawn in a vessel, if poured into a mikveh, it invalidates the mikveh. How much mayim she'uvim is required? According to Hillel, a hin, an amount of 12 lug. According to Shammai, 9 kavin. Finally, a isha who saw dam. According to Shammai, she's only tummy going forward, dayin sha'atan. According to Hillel, we go back to her last bedika, mipkida lepkida. The Gemara told us that there are actually another 2 cases where we find a machlekes. One is regarding smicha, one is regarding hechsher l'tumah, but for 2 different reasons, Rav Huna did not list those cases in our list of 3 machlekes, of 3 disputes of Hillel and Shammai. Gemara told us that Rishmo sent a message in the name of his father that the last 180 years prior to the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, Malchus Harisha, Rome, spread its authority over Klal Yisrael. 80 years prior to the Churban, the Rabbanan were geyser 2 gzeres, Tumas Eretz Ha'amim, as well as Tumah to Kleis Chuchis. And finally, 40 years prior to the Churban, the Sanhedrin, the Bezdin HaGadol, moved to the Chanus, and they conducted Dini Nefashis no longer. The Gemara Stira, how can we say that it was those Rabbanan who made those gzeres, and not the 2 Yosef? We seem to have a contradiction between 2 brises. Who were the ones who enacted those gzeres? The Gemara will address them soon, but first we brought a Mishnah that there are 6 fakes, 6 uncertain tumais, which on account of those we actually burn truma that comes into contact with them. One is Beis HaPras, Eretz Ha'amim, Bigdei Ha'aretz, Kelim HaNimtzoim, Roikin HaNimtzoim, and Mei Ragli Adam. So if the truma comes into contact with these items, we burn the truma. However, if there's only a suffix whether there was contact, we have a 3 machlekes. According to the Tanakama, it's tar. According to Rav Yosef Shesay Yachid, we burn it. According to the Chachamim Shesay Yachid, we are toilen. We don't burn. It is pending. In the Shesay Rabbim, it is completely tar. The Gemara concluded that there must have been 3 phases to the Gzer of Eretz Amim. It began with the 2 Yosefs, who were very lenient in their proposal. They only applied an uncertain level of tumah to the gush, to the glob of Eretz Amim. The Rabbanan of the 80 years added another stringency regarding the Avid, the airspace. It too has a din of litlois. Finally, in Usha, much later on, they added another stringency, that the gush, the glob of earth of Eretz Amim that comes into contact with truma, it causes the truma to be burnt. Regarding the airspace, they left it as is. It only has a din of tliyah. Finally, Gemara told us regarding the gzera of kleis chuchis, why indeed did the Rabbanan apply the dini tuma to glassware, since it is formed from sand? It's similar to klei cheres, to earthenware kalim, and therefore it has tuma as well. What follows is that it cannot be toil in a mikveh. In order to purify it from tumah, you need to break it. And that is in accordance with the halacha that we find by klei cheres as well. The Gemara said there's one exception. According to Reb Meir, we follow the maimit. We follow the thing that maintains it. For instance, if the kleis chuchas got a hole which rendered it unfit for use, and he plugged it with a metal plug, the kli now has the status of a klei matris, a metalware kli, and has all the dinim of klei matris according to Reb Meir.